Live. We are live. Welcome everybody to the Pugs and Parker stream, heard each and every Monday through Thursday evening right here, 9 o'clock Central Time. I'm Pugs. He's Parker. He'll be along shortly. This is the second of two streams that we do every day. We do one stream, myself. I do it alone. It's called High Noon with me, Pugs. Noon till whenever. Noon till when the news runs out, as I like to say. What is High Noon? High Noon is Hot Topics. It's classic rip and read style, man. I wake up early in the morning and I compile all of the day's trending topics, hot topics, current events, headlines, whatever it is that people are buzzing about, and I run them down for you every day at noon. Here's what we don't do. We don't do divisive politics. I'm trying to do over the back fence talk radio. That's what we're doing. There is so much other stuff out to talk about other than just, how you voted. You're blue, you're red, whatever. I'm so done with that. So every day at noon, you can come, you can join me. Look, sometimes we're going to have to put a toe in politics, right? Like we're talking about the indictment. We're talking about that. That's big news. That's what people are buzzing about. But we don't get bogged down in the minutiae, and we don't choose sides, and we don't go, you know how I feel about this. You got you got like a percentage of crazy here and a percentage of crazy there, and then there's us. There's us in the middle. And we have little differences about all kinds of things, but we can pretty much work it out. Ain't that right, James Parker? That describes he and I to a T. Look at him. Look at him. The handsome Frankenstein. What did I call you? The edgelord of Tyler? What was the name that I gave you?
That doesn't sound very flattering, but I'll take it. What's an edgelord?
I don't know, but it's a cool word that kids use. I don't know what it means.
I'm good with a weed eater. Is that what it means?
Do you know what it means? Do you have any idea what edgelord means?
Like a Dungeons and Dragons thing? You about to out nerd me here? Is that what you're doing?
I don't know. Let's bring in our other friend here. He's always along for a couple of kicks and giggles. It's E.
Hey!
E, one of Dallas's premier artists. E the artist. How are you, boys?
Doing good.
Yeah.
I'm, uncovering from this move. I finally feel like I've got my tentacles in all the.
What is uncovering from a move?
You know how when you move in,
recovering, and I just busted you. Okay, I gotcha.
No, uncovering. You get boxed in. Like they just come and they just keep on bringing boxes and boxes, and like your whole world is in a box.
Where'd you move to?
Say like about a couple miles from the house.
A block away, like around the other. He moved to a tonier section of Highland Park.
Why would you move from one part of Highland Park to another part of Highland Park, Emil?
I have a big business plan.
It's a property deal, dude. Just don't ask questions. Just go with it and be pleased that you've got a buddy with a bunch of homesteads in Highland Park.
Right, just drink your fireball.
Whatever that means. I don't know what that means. Anyway, very excited about today's show. But first, we've got to do a little bit of maintenance, okay? I've got to update the audience on my ankle. My ankle. James, did you hear what happened to my ankle? Oh, my God.
Half of a dog doo-doo about your ankle. Go ahead, though. Maybe this is a better story than I'm anticipating.
Why would I tell you that I've suffered a serious injury? Look at this.
Regale me.
Look at that.
Okay, that looks pretty bad.
Yeah, that's pretty bad.
That looks pretty bad.
Get that one up close. Yeah, I'm pretty much like, look at that one. You know why?
Wow. Did you do the Dak Prescott thing?
No. Dude, I was playing baseball with my kid, and I was shagging flies, and he chucked one, and I forgot that I was 53, and, my head said, you're 17. You can take a good track on that ball, and you could probably chase it down, and my body went, no, you can't do that, and the end result was my ankle buckled, so I am doing better. I've been drinking a lot of whiskey today. Actually, that's not true. This is only my second 2 fingers of it. But
I think alcohol is good for swelling, though, because it's a blood thinner, right?
I don't know. I don't have any pain medication. I don't have anything. I mean, it really hurts. Obviously, it's really going to hurt. But I've broken my ankle so many times in my life. I'm used to it.
How very Western of you.
What do you mean? Oh, yeah, the whiskey?
Drinking alcohol and, putting off your pain.
Jeff says, what are the blisters? I don't know what those blisters are. I have blisters where it's swole, where it's swelled. Anyway, we don't care about this kind of stuff. We've got a big show today, and we've got an important.
Wait, what is with the blisters?
I don't know. I'm not asking questions, James. It's why I don't go to the doctor.
He had just been to see Tony Robbins, and he walked across the coals.
Yes, it was the hot cold thing.
Oh, I see. Yeah, the coals, the hot coals.
James, there are so many little things wrong with me that if I start asking questions, I probably won't start with the blisters. There's a whole other list. Once you get to be a certain age, am I right here? You start to have pains in muscles that you didn't know were even muscles until you turned 50.
Oh, it's just ridiculous.
And you're much older than me, and you're far more athletic. All right, can we get into this? I want to get into this. I'm very excited.
Please do. Go ahead.
All right, tonight's show, we've got a guest, a guy who I've admired for quite some time here in local Dallas-Fort Worth media. I said today on the noon show when I was talking about this guy, I said, when I think, my Midwestern, south side of Chicago sort of idea of what a man should be is one thing. But then when we imagine what a Texan is, Jody Dean to me has always sort of been like the quintessential Texas dude. He's big. He's authoritative. He's no bullshit, man. Like when he says something, you got to take. You don't fuck around with Jody Dean. That's just the vibe that he gives off. He's a man of faith, a man of strong faith. He's a football guy, and he's a media legend here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Let's bring him in. Look at him. Look at him. He looks like pissed off Santa right now. Look at him. Mr. Dean, welcome.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. It's good to be here. Let me correct you at least on one thing. Strong faith is not correct. Weak.
No.
Very, very weak and stumbling, always.
I always thought that you are a Bible scholar. I've seen you go toe-to-toe with people on Bible passages, and you seem to really know your stuff.
Well, I went to college as a theology major.
Okay.
And wasted my parents' money, and some of it stuck. I was talking to my daughter the other night, and I was like, can you imagine me majoring in theology? But I think life is a good teacher. I have always been a good student.
Well, that's an interesting thing that just occurred here. I want to know more about this origin story, if you'd indulge me here. Now, at some point, you went to school.
Yeah.
So you had faith. So there must have been life and the unfurling of years. Did they tempt your faith? I mean, where did the break occur?
Oh, it's a very long story. The best way I can describe it is there are two me's. There's the one that really wants to try to do the right thing, and then there's the other one that really hasn't always cared too much about that. And they are always in conflict. And so the origin story was that I grew up in a very church-based home. My dad was a Baptist. My mother and grandmother were Church of Christ. And so when it came time for me to graduate from high school, they kind of fought over where I was going to go. My dad wanted me to go to Baylor. My grandmother and mother wanted me to go to Abilene Christian. And my dad said, well, if you're going to send him there, then you're going to pay for it. And so my mom and grandmother did. And I actually went on the intent of getting a football scholarship. And I walked on, and I realized when I noticed the wide receivers were bigger than I am that it was probably not my future. But I'd also discovered campus radio. And to be truthful, when I was about 13 years old, I'd started in television at Channel 5 in Fort Worth. And we had a late night monster movie showcase called the Museum of Horrors. And I would go out there Saturday nights about 8 o'clock, and we were on after the 10 o'clock news. In fact, I have the singular distinction of having had a program canceled by Saturday Night Live. We'd been on the air for 2 years, and the station manager came in one day and he said, I'm afraid you guys are out. There's this new show coming, and it probably won't last very long. And that was it. But I got to be in the prop room. I got to hang out with people, 12 o'clock. I'm 13, 14 years old out at a TV station, literally in the middle of the night, get home 2 o'clock in the morning, and I just loved it. And then my high school girlfriend loved this radio station that I'd never heard of because I grew up in Fort Worth, and I knew KVIL only through her. My favorite stations were KFJZ and stations like that, AM stations. And so I listened to this station in Dallas or Highland Park, and what I heard really appealed to me. And so from about 16 on, that's all I wanted to do was work for that radio station. And there were a couple of side trips along the way. I was the original MC and rodeo announcer at Billy Bob's Texas when we first opened more than 40 years ago now. I was there the day. Yeah.
Wow.
I remember loading in the tables the day that President Reagan was nearly assassinated. And that was opening week. And we did not know when we opened if we would have a soul in the building, because who was in the mood? And as it turns out, we broke fire code and had to close the doors at one point. But, just I came from a family that enjoyed the arts. My mom was a music teacher. And that was my adoptive family. My birth family, which I found when I was almost 50 years old, also had quite a few hams in it. And it turns out I took after both of them. And
nature and nurture.
Yeah, nature and nurture. And it's odd that you mentioned that, because I'd always thought that it was all nurture. I really didn't ascribe to the idea that nature had that much to do with it until I found my birth family. And I realized at the time I really was going through a crisis, and I needed to find out if there were any more nuts in the tree. And sure enough, my birth father was a carbon copy of me, or I was a carbon copy of him, to the point that we'd both been married 4 times. We both were horrible in terms of being good husbands, being responsible partners. I'd actually met him once. He didn't know he had a son. I didn't know that he was my birth father. He came into Billy Bob's, Texas. He was a builder, and he had a blonde under one arm and a brunette under the other. And when I saw his picture years later, I knew exactly who he was. And I realized I'd met him before. And it was.
So you had met him. You had encountered this man.
I'd actually encountered him. Yeah, he came. In fact, one of my sisters was one of the waitresses at Billy Bob's Texas, and probably the only one I didn't ask out.
Yeah, well, that could have been meant.
What year was this?
It was 1981.
81.
So you said something. I just want to backtrack here, and I probably shouldn't derail in this way, but it's interesting to me because I've never really seen it in this way. The Dallas-Fort Worth market. You're telling me that there was a time when they were considered 2 separate markets. You said you were more familiar with the Fort Worth, because now it's all. I came here in 2001. It was always one market.
Right. It kind of was. I don't know if, in the larger sense, advertisers or broadcasters really thought of it that way, but the ratings, I don't know that they measured them that way. I just know that there were big stations in Fort Worth and big stations in Dallas. And being from Fort Worth, I'd never been past 360 East until I was 16 years old. The only 2 times I think I'd visited Dallas before then was to visit an aunt. And that was it. The first time I ever went to Dallas, spent any considerable time, was when my high school girlfriend took me to Bobby McGee's Magic Time Machine for my 16th birthday. And it was a revelation. All of a sudden,
the same one on Beltline?
I think this one was closer to downtown.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember exactly where it was. I just remembered that it was the big city, the tall buildings. But yeah, this is the coolest area in the world. I've never been any place I don't like and couldn't live anywhere. I've always found something to like about the people, the place, and all that. But this is my home, and it's always been the best of both worlds, because you go this direction, you get one kind of culture, go that direction, get another kind of culture. And so, the idea that I've been able to stay here for my entire career, never wanted to go anywhere else, never entertained any ideas of leaving the market, didn't want to.
Oh, that's such a blessing. And now you've been able to carve out both a career in radio and television. How was that done? That's the rare double. See, because you were able to be a personality on the radio, but then also taken seriously as a straight news anchor for CBS television. How did that all come about?
Well, I had done a TV show for a while. I'd been on Good Morning Texas as a guest host back when Todd Whitthorne was the host, and he had to miss a few shows from time to time, and so they'd call me. Scott Sams followed him. I would spell Scott every once in a while. And so at some point, Michelle Redman, who had been a producer at Channel 8, came to Channel 11, and she decided that she wanted to produce an hour-long afternoon variety show, which was a lot of fun. I got to work with Brenda Teal, and we had great guests. I remember a very young Beyonce on that show when she was with Destiny's Child, and Dad was driving them around Texas in a van. So we got to meet all these really, really cool people. Charlton Heston. I mean, we had some big stars come through. Well, that didn't go very far because, it's very hard to do an afternoon variety show, a local afternoon variety show, talk show. We had a live audience at one point, and that ended because people work. It wasn't like the 50s when you could say, hey, we're doing a TV show, and people would line up outside the door. We got to the point where we were so in need of a live audience that we would raid local nursing homes and bring in residents from local nursing homes. And the live audience, this is a true story, the live audience went away one day when the camera was panning across the audience. And they caught a gentleman on the front row who had the oxygen tube. And he was asleep. He'd fallen asleep during the show, but it looked for all the world like he died. And the next day, no live audience. And from there on out, that was it.
You're scaring the kids.
Yeah, exactly. And so Tracy Rowlett at the time was had just started at CBS 11, and he's called me one day and he said, why don't we go to dinner at Dave & Buster's? And so we went to Dave & Buster's, and we're sitting there, and I tell the story that Tracy got me drunk. We'd had a few martinis, and he said, would you like to do news? Well, I'd been doing news for a while at that point at KRLD.
Jody, if you don't mind for a minute, for those of us, my friends in Chicago and around the country who are listening, Tracy Rowlett is a decade upon decade news anchor here, 10 o'clock news anchor, CBS News. So that's who Jody's talking about.
The real deal. Yeah,
he was the icon of real news journalism here locally.
And for whatever reason, he thought I had a chance of doing it. And so he said, would you like to? And so I became the anchor of the noon and 5 o'clock, or actually 4 o'clock newscast. We created a 4 o'clock newscast, and I got to work with Renee Seiler and Karen Borda and some really incredible people, and just a wonderful group of folks, and thoroughly enjoyed it. And I did that for about 10, 11 years. And at about 2003 or so, Ron Chapman, who was our legendary morning radio DJ here in Dallas-Fort Worth, one of them, called me up and said, would you like to follow me at K-Love, which was the oldies station at the time. And he and I had been together at KBIL. I'd been his producer. And, you don't follow Roger Staubach.
No.
You just don't do it. Danny White never had a prayer.
No.
And had he retired at KBIL, I would have said, no, forget it. But if Danny White or if Roger Staubach had gone to, say, St. Louis, well, that's different. You don't have two shadows following you. So I said yes. For a time there, I was doing morning radio and afternoon TV and sleeping 4 hours a day. And at that point, I decided to go full-time radio. And the reason I did it was simple. If I did morning radio, I could be there in the afternoon for my daughter's events. If I did TV, I couldn't. So I picked radio.
You said something that is just so close to my situation. Did you know a guy? Do you remember a radio DJ personality named Neil Rogers?
Say the name again.
Neil Rogers. He was like he was a god in Miami radio.
This is a terrible thing. I just didn't care about anybody outside the market. I didn't pay attention. In fact, I cared very little about anybody or any other station in town. I didn't. We lived in a bubble. KBIL was a bubble, and as far as I was concerned, my job was to beat everybody else so badly that they wanted to quit the business.
Well, I'm not in the market that I grew up in, so look, I'm a geek. The situation with Neil Rogers was a lot like that. He died suddenly, and this was when I was looking for work about 15 years ago in Miami. They called me and they wanted to talk to me, and I was just petrified to replace Neil Rogers. And I'm like, you know what? You can't replace a legend because everybody hates the guy who comes in. The phone lines are, you suck, I hate you, I miss Neil. And then they make you take that for 6 months. And
I got a call one morning not long after Ron retired, and the lady said, "You'll never be Ron Chapman."
Exactly.
He was caviar and your barbecue.
And you can't defeat that. You can't.
And I said to her, I said, "Man, more people eat barbecue than caviar. I'm good with that, So
that is true. But
that's a great comeback.
You can't be that guy, though. You can't be the guy that follows the legend. You have to be the guy that follows the guy that followed the legend.
Exactly right.
Because that guy is loved because he's not the guy that replaced the legend.
Jody Dean, you mentioned living in other places. Where all did you travel? Did you leave this market?
No. This is the only place I've ever worked. Obviously I watched some trajectories that took people outside of Dallas-Fort Worth. And I was very proud of those people. And obviously, I recognize that it takes a lot of talent and a lot of tenacity to move up from the fifth or fourth largest market in the United States and go even higher. And so, but I was never jealous or envious or going, geez, that'd be fun. I still don't. Never had the urge. And I have been everywhere. I've been lots of places all over the world. The only place I think I might want to do radio outside this market might be Australia. The reason I say that is because radio and television in Australia is still, it's a little bit more creative than we've become here. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's because they have the latitude. I don't know if it's just the nature of the continent or the people or whatever. But I just never really, for one thing, you have to learn all the street names. And I didn't need to do that.
Oh, yeah.
Right. I knew that in Dallas County, the town is pronounced Lancaster. Uh-huh. In Fort Worth, the street is pronounced Lancaster. So, little things like that. And when people would call up and say, well, where do I want to take my wife for Valentine's for, dinner? I knew the restaurants. I knew the theaters. I knew the territory like Professor Harold Hill. I knew where I was, and I was perfectly content to stay here.
Yeah. I mean, my partner Kelly and I, we had the exact opposite. We didn't know anything about it. We were dropped in this town from 30,000 feet and said sink or swim. So our idea from the very beginning was, because we knew that we would only embarrass ourselves trying to pronounce street names and suburbs and stuff like that. Our track was, we're here, we don't know anything, show us your town. And so we then made the listeners, and of course, everything we did was, oh my God, this is so great. Last night was, and that in some way sort of tethered us to a new audience. It was like, okay, they're trying. They're not coming in and they're not being a-holes. They're trying. Yeah.
That's the greatest way to ingratiate yourself anywhere is to ask the people where you are about where you are. Everybody likes to talk about where they live. They like to, I know this Italian joint, I know this barbecue place, I know this great restaurant or bar. And so people love to share that information. That's one reason I love to go to New York. I mean, New Yorkers have this reputation as being harsh and, tough and all that sort of thing. And that's true. But right around the corner, they'll give you the shirt off their back. And so when you go to New York, I ask the cabbie, I'd get in conversations, and basically that's what you did. You came to town and you just asked people, tell me about where you live. Well, who wouldn't do that? And it's a great approach.
Yeah. James, Emil, do you have anything? I've got a whole bunch of stuff I want to talk to him about, but I don't want to occupy all the time here. So, James, anything for Mr. Dean?
Do you want me to do the basic framework?
I was going to get into that. I was going to lead into that because I had a question to start off with, but I was just wondering if you had any questions pertaining to just, the man himself.
That's my next one. So go ahead and do your crafty lead-in.
Okay. Well, I wanted to go back a little bit to something that you just said. Your relationship with Ron Chapman.
Yeah.
Ron Chapman is about as if there was a Mount Rushmore of Dallas-Fort Worth radio personalities, they'd carve him first. So you started out as his producer, his intern. Tell us a little bit about the legendary Ron Chapman, because he's no longer with us. And I know that you had a close working relationship. I don't know what it was personally like. I mean, I worked for a Radio Hall of Fame legend too. So my relationship with him, I love him, but it was very complicated.
Yeah.
Because they get to be where they are for a reason. And
oh boy.
Tell me a little bit about the great Mr. Chapman.
Well, we first met when I was at Billy Bob's, and we hadn't opened yet, and we were putting the speakers up in the rodeo arena that night. And back in those days, I had this fringe jacket, and I've still got the hat. And I had the long beard was black then, hair was a little bit longer, and I'm in the rodeo arena, and we're raising the speakers. And so Ron Chapman and Larry Dixon, who was another legendary DJ in this market, came in for a pre-opening tour, and I'd already sent Ron an air check. I'd worked at KXOL in Fort Worth, and then I worked at KLIF AM when it was playing country music. I was doing one shift on Sunday mornings, and there's no worse shift in the world than Sunday mornings on a country radio station, because everybody was out last night sleeping in and they ain't going to church. And so nobody wants to hear cheating songs on the way to Sunday school. So it was deader than a doornail. And so I was working at Billy Bob's at the same time. And so Ron and Larry walked in. And because I'd already sent Ron an air check, I walked up to him and I stood a head taller than he did. And I had on riding heels, so I was even a little taller than that. And I stuck out my hand and I said, I want to come work for you. And he heard that all the time, of course, from people in the business. And Ron had this inimitable way of speaking where he went, yes, of course you do. Come see me some morning and watch the show. And I said, I'll be there in the morning. And so after we finished up that night, I drove straight to the Capitol Bank building parking lot, which is now Mockingbird Station at Central and Mockingbird. Okay. And I waited in the parking lot for him. And when he got there, I was at the door waiting for him. And I went upstairs and watched the show that day. And nothing happened for about 3 or 4 months after that. And then one day, he called me and said, we have one shift open, and it's Tuesday mornings from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. Do you want it? And
yes.
I didn't let him finish the sentence.
Yeah.
And that's how it started. I worked overnights, and then I went to 7 to 11 weeknights, and I sucked. I was terrible. I thought I was funny. I wasn't. I didn't know how to be funny. I didn't know there's actually a technique to anything. I had no idea, none whatsoever. And Chapman came in one day, it was 1987 at this point, and he said, you're fired. We're taking you off the marquee. You're no longer going to be a star. And he said, we're going to make you a producer. And our music director at the time had gone to Nashville to work for Jimmy Bowen at MCA Records. And Sandy Hopkins, who was Ron's producer, was assigned to become the music director. And unfortunately, she died and was never able to take that job on. She would have been fantastic. She was spectacular. But Ron made me his producer. And so I got to work behind the scenes until about 1994, about 10 years. And a little bit more than 10 years, actually, off and on. And it was like playing for Vince Lombardi. I mean, there were days, he was, ultimately, he was like my second father, or third father in my case. He was a very close personal friend. There were times when I remember one night we'd had a meeting. The Cowboys broadcast rights had come to KBIL, and we were having a meeting, and I asked a question. He didn't like it. He threw me out of the meeting. Oh, it infuriated me. And so 3 of my friends, Scott West and Tim Vasquez, who are no longer with us, unfortunately, and Michael Ray, who now works for the North Texas Tollway Authority, took me to Louie's, the bar on Henderson across
Love
Central.
Louie's, best pizza in all of Dallas.
And got me drunk and talked me out of going by Ron's house and shooting up his front door. I literally wanted to, in those days, my wife at the time was a realtor, and she carried a gun in the car, and I was really pissed. I really thought, why not? And they talked me out of that.
Why not?
And so I stuck around, and over time, I think about him every day. In fact, shortly after he died, a cardinal appeared in our backyard, and my partner, Fiona, said, what if that's Ron? What do you think he's saying to you? And I didn't hesitate. I said, edit 20%. Because there was never anything that was quite good enough.
Never.
I could never get him to go to that level until the last few years. But in the last few years, he realized, he used to say that if he died on Wednesday, he'd be forgotten by Friday. And by the time he died, he realized how much people really loved him. And that was really cool to see. It was really a special time, and we talked all the time. I'd go see him, he was quite something, but not everybody's cup of tea. I know I wasn't. My problem was that I tried to imitate Ron 20 years after you could do that. In terms of how you behaved around the office and staff and that sort of thing, I was still one of those, morning show guys, and it had to be perfect. It had to be right, and that just didn't play by the time I was doing it. And, I rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. So did he. I didn't see anything wrong with it because I thought that's what you did in the pursuit of excellence. Well, he achieved a level that I could only imagine. And a lot of people owe their careers. In fact, I think a lot of people in this market for a long time owed the salaries they made and the lives they achieved because of Ron Chapman, Marty Haig, who was the big TV guy in town for years, and Burl Osborne, who was the big newspaper guy in town for years. And I think and Bob Stanford, who was the advertising guy. I think those 4 guys probably did as much in this market, along with, now that I think about it, probably Kim Dawson. Those people probably set the standard and took us from pretty much a backwater kind of a burg into a cosmopolitan, metropolitan mindset that led to higher salaries, better jobs, more security, and that lasted a long time, and Ron was at the front of that.
I know E the artist here, local artist extraordinaire. Jody, I don't know if you know E the artist. E used to live next door to what's your Ron Chapman story? You were his neighbor for years.
I lived in the same building when when you were going to go shoot his front door. What address was
He was
that?
living in Caruth Haven at the time. He actually had a house. Are you talking about the Warrington?
No.
Okay.
I'm talking
was
about
it the
over
Dondy
at,
condominiums? They're off Monticello.
no, these were the ones off of Holland.
I don't remember those. I really don't.
Were they? Do you remember when his place burned to the
Oh,
ground?
yeah, I know the story.
Oh, that's
yeah.
the one.
I do know the story.
Because that
yeah.
was Emil's place too.
Yeah, that was my place. I
Memorable.
lived in the same building as him, and you know how you said you had two people. You had one side of your life. You were this person, and some days you were that person. Well, I had the same thing going on, and my level of this and Ron being in the building, like we'd be coming home when he'd be leaving for work, or the party would still be continuing.
He was a party boy, is what he's trying to say. And
Oh yeah. yeah.
Ron
Well, let
was
me
a
tell you
morning
about.
man.
Let me tell you a little story about Ron. Many years ago, when I was still working overnights, the alternator died on I had a Nissan 280 or something like that, and the alternator died. And so Ron said, "Why don't you drive my Cadillac Seville for a few days while you get it fixed?" Because he could get another car, and he was like that. He'd do things like that out of the blue. His charity was surprising and very generous, and he did that with everybody. And he said, "Would you like to drive my car?" And I went, "Sure." Well, of course, you know what I did. The first thing back in those days, I drove up and down Greenville Avenue for like 2 nights, cruising, man. I had my elbow on the
Yes.
And when I turned it back into Ron, this is a true story. There were 2 big fat joints that I left in the middle of the console, right next to the stick. And
You're welcome.
I gave him the keys, and I forgot all about it. And about 2 days later, I remembered, oh my God. and for like 35 years, he didn't say a word, never said a word. And so finally, years later, like I guess about 5 or 6 years ago, I asked him, I said, "Ron, whatever happened to those 2 doobies I left in the center console?" And he said, "I refuse to answer on the grounds that it may tend to incriminate."
All right. Now that's good to know, because one of the things that look, I didn't know Ron Chapman. I know of Ron Chapman. Ron Chapman was an incredibly important person in this town for the company that I worked for when I was but a mere peon. He was a man of power, however. And one of the reasons that I really wanted to talk to you was, obviously, we're doing this Live 105.3 podcast where we're sort of trying to figure out what exactly happened there, because all the shows were sold out. The advertisers were super happy. Right up until the final day, we could do an appearance and draw 600 people on a Wednesday night.
Yeah.
We didn't understand what happened with that station. But I want to go back to the beginning, because Ron was not only just the morning man, Ron was an incredibly powerful man with CBS radio programming at the time. So do you have any recollections about the switch when we're going to talk to Reed Reeker, who was the GM at the time that 105.3 flipped? But I'm wondering, CBS corporate, what was their attitude, or not corporate, but other established CBS entities here in the market? Ron Chapman, what was his attitude towards the Animal House type? The Tiffany Network, for crying out loud, we're CBS. And now all of a sudden, what were the thoughts? What were you seeing when the station first popped up?
I think Ron, he was always actively critiquing, but he wasn't a critic. He was he was a harsh coach. It was like playing for Vince Lombardi, like I said, but he was much more concerned with music stations' competition. But by the same token, he viewed everything, whether it was a newspaper or a TV station or another radio format or anything, as another platform against which we had to compete. And so there were some that he was a little bit more okay with and didn't mind so much. But the music stations, they were to be destroyed. They were to be leveled, put out of business if you could. dance around the burning embers if you can. But as far as the atmosphere at 105.3, I think to some degree, on some level, he kind of welcomed it, because as that grew, music radio, as far as the way we'd done it, had started to decline to a certain degree. And not necessarily in terms of popularity, but in terms of quality. And Ron was always about quality. He loved the business. He learned from the legendary Gordon McClendon, the man who essentially invented top 40 radio.
Cliff, yeah.
In the southern United States.
Yeah.
And so, he'd sat at the knee of another hard driving, very demanding person, which is kind of why he took on that personality himself. And so he was always hyper aware of potential threats. At one time, KLIF used to win the ratings when they were in their heyday with a 22 share. And when we were in our heyday at KVIL, we would win with a 13 share. Well, now you win with a 4 share. And it's not just because there are more signals, it's because people realize that they have more than one button on their dial.
The cume is tiny compared to what it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, so I think he was appreciative of what...
Cume is a cumulative audience,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
I think that's important, because he was aware of what 105.3 was trying to do. And some way he was a little envious that he was seeing his opportunity to do those same things kind of diminished, because 105.3 allowed a lot of latitude, a lot of creativity, a lot of imagination, about the same time that the music consultants were all saying, well, you got to stick to these songs. You got to stick to the 400 in your playlist, which Ron never did. If there was, I remember a story he told me shortly before he died. A woman had come up to him at some event and she was in tears. And she said, I remember the day that President Reagan was shot. And the morning after, you played Barbra Streisand, Who Will Buy This Wonderful Morning? And it made me cry. And it changed my outlook on everything. And that was in no one's format. I mean, nobody played that song on the radio. Hadn't in at least 30 years. And Ron played it because it suited the occasion. And that was always what he stood for. Recognize and acknowledge the moment. And whatever you can do, try to make that moment meaningful. And music radio was telling you couldn't do that anymore. Meanwhile, 105.3 had an open field. It could do whatever you wanted. You could be whatever you wanted. You could try whatever you wanted. And he saw his ability to do that being shrunk, while other areas were beginning to come along that seemed to maximize it. So I think he was okay with it. I remember when Dan Mason and CBS Radio bought us, everybody in the market, it seemed like, and Mason came to town and we had a meeting at KRLD in the ballpark conference room, which overlooked the visitors' bullpen at the old ballpark in Arlington. And of course, at the end of the meeting, you know how it goes. They say, well, does anyone have any questions? And of course, naturally, I raised my hand. And I looked at Dan Mason and I said, what is your definition of winning? And Mason said, what's your definition of winning? And I said, I think what we're after here is we want to be, and this is terrible looking back on it, like Walmart. We don't care which aisle you shop on, just as long as you come through our door. And Mason goes, that's it. The problem was, about that time, people were telling us people don't want the uniqueness. They don't want imagination in music radio. They just want the hits, just want the hits, just want the hits.
All right.
105.3 didn't have that chain around their ankle. And they could do whatever you wanted. You could do whatever you wanted, and we couldn't do that anymore. And that's one of the reasons Ron became very frustrated. He realized in a few years' time that the only thing that mattered to radio corporations was the stock price, and that was all. And I think that broke his heart to a certain degree.
Wow. One of the questions and you're one of the only people that can answer this question. It's one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on. So here's my big question. I had always been under the impression, from the time that we were at 105.3, that a large reason we've discussed now with a number of people the behavior of Russ Martin, who was the star of the station. My partner Kelly and I had always been led to believe, from the highest ups in management at CBS Radio, that Russ Martin's behavior was due in large part to the fact that he felt indemnified by Ron Chapman. How close were they?
Pretty close. Ron respected Russ. Ron would come to Russ's parties. Russ would come to Ron's events. Russ came to Ron's retirement. He came to his 20th or 25th anniversary at KBIL. Obviously, he'd been in the market since the late 50s. So, yeah, they respected each other. And I think Ron saw that Russ needed someone. And I think Ron tried to be that someone. And I don't know that Russ, I don't know how materially true it was that he was indemnified, but if you had Ron's favor, it sure didn't hurt.
Yeah. Yeah, he was definitely. We were always led to believe that we should be afraid. Kelly, my partner, and I, we should be afraid of Ron Chapman because he's part of Russ's team, and Ron is ultimately Russ can't get you fired, but Ron sure as hell can.
Ron would not do that directly.
Well,
but yeah, if you made him mad, you that was not something you wanted to do.
James, go ahead. You have a couple of static questions here that we're getting everybody to chime in on.
Yeah, so not Ron Chapman, Jody Dean. When did you first know 105.3 existed?
Well, as I said, I just didn't pay much attention to the comings and goings, even in our own cluster. You become aware. Well, I knew Russ and I knew JD back when they did their TV show. They would come in and they would film the Ron Chapman show, and we'd put together bits and things like that they could use on television. I remember one time they came in and we staged it to where they just didn't seem like they wanted to leave, and ultimately the last scene was me carrying Russ and JD out under each arm. I had Russ under one arm and JD under the other, and I just picked them up and dragged them out of the control room under my arms. So we had that relationship for a long time. But
yeah, can we get that?
Is that on YouTube?
That was more by the time I was at KRLD, and I was so busy trying to figure out what I was doing because I didn't really know. I was trying to do a talk show, and so they called me up and said, "Would you like to do a talk show?" Yeah, that'd be fun. I had no idea what I was doing, and I got hammered. Mark Davis put me out of business, and so I went from talk into morning radio news. And that led to TV news. But I became aware of 105.3 when I was there. And in fact, in those days, our studios were in the Carpenter Freeway studios. And after we moved, KRLD moved to the ballpark studios at 1080 Ballpark Way in the old ballpark in Arlington. That's when Live 105 moved into the studios there on Carpenter Freeway. So I became very aware of them then. I obviously knew Russ. I knew what he was doing. I knew what JD was doing. And I just didn't listen. I just never had a chance to really listen because I was so focused on not pissing Ron off and trying to make sure we stayed at 11 or 12 shares. And of course, we had contests. People in the business now are staggered when I tell them. I remember many times when, this was not one time, but one year we gave away a car a week for 12 weeks. And on one of the Thursdays, back in those days, Arbitron would call up the people who had the diary on Thursday or Wednesday and say, "Are you writing your listening habits down?" And so the next day, everybody would be very intentional about writing that down. So Thursday was the big contest day. One Thursday during what we call the KBIL Auto Show, we gave away 6 cars in one day. One day. And so we were so busy trying to come up with a clever way to present all this stuff, you really didn't have time to listen to Mix, or in those days it was Magic or Kiss or whatever it was on the other end of the dial. Didn't care. You just knew that they were there, and if they beat you, you were going to be looking for work. So, but you knew what was happening was exciting because people would talk. You'd hear about it before the internet. People would write about it in the papers and make headlines. But sometimes they'd make a news story on TV. So you knew what was going on. But in our case, and it wasn't just me, most of us were pretty snobbish about it at KBIL. And
yes,
it irritated a lot of people, but hey, success was success and it worked. And so we kept at it.
You guys, to us over at 105.3 were, I don't know, pick your movie, Animal House, Revenge of the Nerds. I mean, we were the nerds and you guys were the frat. Thank you, sir. May I have another? I mean, you guys.
Oh, yeah.
What about you? We've had a number of people. We're talking about Live 105.3, and a number of people have given their It's been all over the road, really. It hasn't been just totally negative. There's been some positive. But what is your recollection of Russ Martin as a man on the street, not as a broadcaster? Can't be denied. He was a tremendously talented broadcaster. He knew what he was doing. But what about at the station cocktail parties? Ron, your boss, loves the kid. What about you?
I didn't. I did initially, but it got to the point where, and I don't know, maybe we were too much alike. But I just, at one point, I don't know when the blanket was finally ripped, but I hadn't talked to him for years prior to his death. Was very sorry to hear about his passing.
Of course, terrible.
But unfortunately, it was not remotely a surprise. And so when I heard about it, I felt it was tragic. It was just tragic, but I didn't, like I said, I didn't not see it coming. And it's a shame too, because as you well know, as you guys know, I mean, so many people in this business, because it is so ego-centered. It is so demanding. It robs you of your social life in many ways. People think they know you, and nobody really does. And I remember, and I cannot remember it, maybe you guys can, but there was one legendary radio guy who had curtains set up to where he didn't have to look at anybody on the way to the studio, headed to work, and nobody was allowed to look at him. And he actually operated, not Russ, but a different guy, operated from another room entirely while his team was in it, because he was so socially dysfunctional. Are you talking
about here in market? Are you talking about in Dallas or something?
No, it wasn't in this market, and I don't remember who it was.
Jonathan Brandmeier, who I worked with in Jonathan Brandmeier. He used to completely seclude off. He had curtains. He had all of that stuff. Yeah.
Well,
maybe there's more.
He probably wasn't the only one. I mean, yeah, and it's tragic because, there's so many parts of the broadcast business that feed the wrong parts of us. And that's not to say it's not great and wonderful. It can feed the right parts of us too. I was seeing a story the other day that Mark Lewis over at KSCS, 25 years ago, he decided that, that Camp Bowie in Fort Worth, which is this long old road that's been there since World War I, looked pretty desolate. And wouldn't it be great if we planted some trees along that? And now if you go there are these beautiful mature oak trees, and it's the 25th anniversary of that. And he got an award the other day from the mayor of Fort Worth. There are a lot of people who look outward. Even Russ. Russ had his fallen, heroes charity, which did so much great work. Very complex people. But yes, by the same token, when you are paid to listen to the sound of your own voice constantly. I worked with people in television when we would do live events. Hey, come meet us. We're going to be at Bob Phillips Country Reporter Festival, or we're going to be at the Peach Festival in Weatherford, or any of those things. They refused to go because they just were not comfortable around the audience and listeners or viewers. And it wasn't normal. Something happened to them, and I think all of us have encountered that. And we're very fortunate if we remain this side of it, because it can be very destructive. And, when you're getting paid a ton of money to talk, it can have an effect. And if you've got any insecurities at all, they can eat you up.
James, Emil, go ahead. I'm taking the line.
Well, I've managed to overcome that by having a steady succession of failures that not allowed to reach that level. But I can understand how some people, if you just succeed, and you're the guy who keeps getting chosen for the next big job, I could very easily see that go to my head. Just like if I was a rock star, I'd probably end up overdosing on cocaine by the time I was 29. So thank God my music ambitions were a complete failure. But I always look, Jody Dean, I'm almost embarrassed to talk to you because I feel like we are, you're the elder statesman of radio when we came up, and you must have thought we were a bunch of clowns. I mean, kind of jealous of the fact that we get to play in the sandbox and do crazy things that you don't get to do. But still, are we just kids playing in a sandbox at Live 105.3 compared to y'all?
No, I think that in many ways, what we did at KBIL was more structured than people realize. Nothing got on the air if you didn't know how you were going to get out of it. Never get into anything you don't know how you're going to get out of. That's an old radio rule, and we live by it. Every bit with Ron Chapman and his radio partner, Susie Humphreys. You say this, then I'm going to ask this, and then I'm going to get out, and you'll know the out cue. It was all very well. I mean, it's just like Johnny Carson. The guests knew what Johnny was going to say. Johnny knew what they were going to say. Johnny knew how he was going to answer. It's showbiz. And so what Live 105.3 represented was more freedom and the ability to not have an off ramp, to be able to keep going as long as you wanted to till the break, and maybe it worked and maybe it didn't, but there was never going to be the conversation on the two-way radio after you hit the jingle where Ron would say, "That's not what you were supposed to say." Never happened.
No.
It never happened. And so, you hear that and you think to yourself, or you hear about what people are doing and you go, God, that would be fun. That'd be a lot of fun. And some of it, yeah, you hear it and you go, wait a minute, why'd they do that? What's the point of that? Where's the, but that was our bias speaking. And I think secretly, we all kind of felt like, even though what we were doing was philosophically what we needed to do, Live 105.3 without records was closer to what radio initially was than even we were, where it was just show up in the studio with an apple crate full of music and play whatever the heck you want.
Talent was hired to fill 4 hours and do what you were hired to do it. There was no we didn't do air checks after the shows. We didn't have to submit a list of 10 things to the program director before the show.
Right.
That outlined what it was. They hired us because they trust us to be able to entertain.
And that doesn't exist anymore. The trust is just not there.
No. It's funny, you were very kind about putting the positive spin on how we didn't have exit strategies for our bits, but I would say we were more like Saturday Night Live in the 80s. We didn't know how to end the bits. Too long.
And it got harder on everybody, and it certainly got harder in the last 10 years when all of a sudden, at our height of power, KVIL had 4 commercial breaks an hour, and each commercial break was 3 minutes long. And there was a promo after 2 of them, so maybe, 12 minutes an hour? Maybe more, maybe less. We were always sold out. We'd gross, this is 1986, 87, we were grossing $24 million a year. An adjacency to one of our contests at 7:20 in the morning, you can't imagine how much it costs. It was insane. But there were also 4 newspapers in town and 36 department stores. And I don't know how many car dealers that were all owned by individuals rather than AutoNation. Right. And so they were all spending the money. And so it was easy for us to achieve that. And we really did a great job. But, just 10 years later, the market had completely changed. All of a sudden, there's only 2 newspapers in town. And by God, they're both printed in the same facility, which is insane. So the landscape had changed quite a bit. And so to make do in that environment is tough enough, but to be successful in that environment, as you guys were, is extraordinary. And so, there aren't many stations that have that latitude anymore. I can only think of one still on the air in Dallas-Fort Worth that successfully navigates that.
Ticket, right?
Yeah. I think the Ticket is as close to what we did at KVIL as any station has been since we did it.
I'm not big on giving credit to radio management, but Bruce and DeCat, they've held that station together so incredibly well.
And they've got a harder job too, because whereas for the corporation it's all about the stock price, for management it's all about the comps. Mm-hmm. And if the comps aren't better every month, then somebody's head is going to roll. And it's even more immediate now. I don't think this is a negative statement whatsoever, but it's true. When I left K-Love, and it was about 4 years ago, I guess. Number one, my youngest son said, "Dad, they saved your life. They did you a favor." And he was right. He was absolutely right. My blood pressure was 210 over 110 normally. I used to scare nurses when I'd go get an exam. By the way, Pugs, go see the doctor. How old's your kid?
13.
Go see the doctor. So, I got out of there, and immediately my blood pressure went back to normal. But the stock price then was about $17 a share. Now it's 11 cents. It's 11 cents now.
They're about to do a 30-to-1 reverse stock split. Oh, this is a radio tragedy like no other.
Let me give you a little example of how things have changed. When Mel Karmazin bought KVIL, and Mel Karmazin was the, I don't know how you describe him,
Grand Poobah
of radio. Yeah. He was the guy who made Howard Stern. He was the guy who saw the future in Don Imus. He was that guy. When Mel bought us, he paid more for us than Bum Bright spent to buy the Cowboys from Clint Murkison.
Well, that was probably like $1.50 back in '60.
It was actually $80 million.
80 million.
Whoa.
80 million.
80 million. And-
86, if I remember right. Yeah, but the KBIL was worth more at the time than the Dallas Cowboys. One station was worth more than the Cowboys. That's just not the way it is anymore.
E, go ahead. I see you.
Could you imagine 105.3 at any time taking over the Cowboy signal?
Yeah, I could. I think part of the reason that happened was because of Ron. I remember the champagne flight with Jerry Jones after the contract was signed. That was all Ron. Ron wanted the Cowboys on KBIL, and we had them for a very long time. And when Live 105.3, The Fan got them back, that was kind of coming home for Ron. And he and Jerry Jones were close for Ron's. And in fact, I remember when Ron was inducted to the National Association of Broadcasters Hall of Fame, they had a big thing in Las Vegas. And I called Jerry's secretary, Marilyn, and I said, I don't know if you know about this, but Ron's going in the Hall of Fame. Jerry Jones and his wife flew out to Vegas to be there because, and I'll tell you this, and this is a true story. Mel Karmazin was the one who taught Jerry that the NFL wasn't asking enough for broadcast rights. Okay. And it was Ron who introduced Jerry to Mel. And I remember the meetings when we were trying to get the Cowboys rights. How do you advertise, promote Cowboys on a female demographic station? We owned women listeners. They just listened to us and nobody else. How do you do that? Well, the idea was not for us to go in and talk about the frozen tundra flambeau field. That didn't do it. What we did was we positioned all these guys playing football for the Cowboys as 10-year-olds who grew up to live a dream. And it worked. And that's how we were able to essentially operate 3 radio stations under one set of call letters. Ron Chapman Radio, KVIL Radio, Cowboys Radio. It's 3 different stations on one frequency. And it worked because of how we positioned it. And it was no mean trick either, because I remember a lot of women were upset. We feel betrayed, you're getting the Cowboys, but it worked. So when the Cowboys came back to 105.3, I think Ron kind of felt like he was bringing them home again. But to finish that story, Mel was the guy, as I said, who told Jerry, you're not asking enough for your broadcast rights. You see what I just paid for him, right? Well, then it was Mel who took this guy who kind of had a newspaper and this fledgling network back to the NFL and walked him into the owners' meeting and said, fellas, I think you really need to talk to this guy. He's got the money. He's willing to spend it. And I genuinely, and that's where we got Rupert Murdoch. Jerry was the guy who walked Rupert in to the NFL.
For the Fox deal.
Thanks to Ron's deal, thanks to Mel Karmazin. And without the NFL network, Fox doesn't exist.
Right, yeah.
The NFL network and broadcast rights of the NFL established Fox as a network, and the rest is as we know.
I mean, the Simpsons did some, but no, we're at the NFL. It was the acquisition of professional football for the fledgling Fox network that made.
And it was Jerry Jones who facilitated.
And wasn't it, if I remember, wasn't it CBS that they took it from?
Yes, and if you remember, CBS was out in the wasteland for like 2 or 3 years. They tried everything. They had no football for, I think, 3 or 4 years. And they didn't know what to do. And it just killed them. I think the only show they had at the time that might have worked for them was Murder, She Wrote or something like that. And they were no sports to speak of other than a little golf, but nothing to follow it in prime time.
They had recently acquired David Letterman from NBC. And I remember when CBS lost football, David Letterman had only been at CBS for like a year, and he was so mad.
Oh, he was
every
furious.
Every day he'd come out on the air and he'd be like, well, now we got nothing. He'd just be like, so yeah.
It's amazing what a small world it is and what a smaller world broadcasting is.
Did you remember when Live 105.3 went away, when it flipped to the Fan?
Yeah, I do.
Now you were still at CBS, right?
I was.
Rumblings?
Yeah, I was.
Did you hear stuff? I mean, what did you know, and when did you know it, sir?
Well, I wasn't quite sure why they did it, because number one, I guess success breeds imitators. The ticket was so strong in those days. I don't know that we really realized how much room there was for sports talk in this market, even though it had grown. The Dallas-Fort Worth is just at the time was exploding in terms of population, as it's continued to do. But it never dawned on anyone, I think, that we needed a second all sports station and then a third for a period of time. Could we support it? Was it possible? And for a time we did. For a time it was possible. But we also learned real quick, and as we were watching from the outside looking in, that you really can't do that unless you have somebody's play-by-play rights. You've got to have play-by-play rights on your station if you want to do all sports. And I think 105.3, The Fan, is still here today because they ultimately got the Cowboys, Rangers. Now, it's funny because KVIL gets credit all the time for being the first station in America to broadcast a football game in stereo, which we did. We pioneered that. But we'd actually mastered that because at the time, the Dallas Mavericks were on WBAP, but because their contract conflicted with the Rangers, sometimes games had to be bumped somewhere, and if there was no place to put them, the third choice was KVIL. So we had in fact, we had Moody Madness when the Mavericks played the Seattle Sonics at Moody Coliseum, in front of 6,000 people under a low roof. We had those games. Ted Davis, who I think is now with the Bucks, Milwaukee Bucks.
You mean Moody Coliseum at SMU? Why did that happen?
Moody Coliseum at SMU, yeah.
Why was that?
They couldn't use a Reunion Arena was booked. World Court Tennis was there. Lamar Hunt.
Excuse me,
tennis tournament.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So they had no place to play the playoff game. They had to play at Moody Coliseum.
That shows you how far the NBA has come.
That's right. And it's funny because people were talking back then about, well, will the NBA make it in Dallas-Fort Worth? Well, anybody who ever went to a South Oak Cliff or Dunbar game knew it was going to make it here. I went to Pascal, and Pascal and Dunbar could fill up Daniel Meyer Coliseum with the Tarrant County Convention Center easily. So it wasn't a question of whether it would make it or not. It was who was going to carry the games and where were they going to play. So, and we might put a mic over that basket, and we could catch people dribbling from right to left in stereo, and that's where we learned to do sports in stereo.
James, I can't fix my mic arm because it collapsed in the middle of the show.
Don't feel bad. My air conditioner's not on. Excuse me.
No, mine doesn't work either. It's very hot. All right, hold on. Let's put this down. Jody, what are you doing now? Where can people find you? Tell us about the
Or
current.
do you care? Yeah.
I don't miss being on the air every day. It was exciting. It was a lot of fun. For a while, I kind of futzed around and didn't really know what I wanted to do. Last year, just on a whim, they were shooting a series based on the Gospels, the four Gospels in the Bible, in Midlothian. And so I went down and joined the cast of The Chosen for season 3. And I hadn't been on a film set since Pure Country in 8 Seconds back in the 90s. And it was fun. I'm a theater kid. I grew up playing football and I was a theater kid. And so it was a blast. And then after that, I was like, well, what do I want to do now? And my younger son, who is a lighting specialist and a rigger on a TV series, he's done Yellowstone, 1883, Tulsa King. He's done a bunch of shows. He's a wonderful kid. I'm so proud of it. Said, Dad, you'd really enjoy working on these sets. And so that's what I did. For the last 6 months, I've been working as a construction set, whatever you want to call it, prop maker for Taylor Sheridan. We're doing Bass Reeves, the story of one of the few black U.S. deputy marshals west of the Mississippi post-Civil War. It's a really, really cool story about an actual human being who really lived, a historical figure. And as opposed to so many films, he's not a complicated hero. He was a man of integrity, incredible accomplishments, even though he couldn't read or write. He was a runaway slave who became a father to a wonderful family, husband and father. He was a man of integrity, and 3,000 felony arrests in what were then the Indian Territories. One of the people he arrested was his own son. And so they're telling that story in an 8-part streaming series. I think it's going to premiere in October.
And this is a Taylor Sheridan project?
It's a Taylor Sheridan project. David Aiello is the star. He's a wonderful fellow, a great guy, and he plays Bass Reeves. Dennis Quaid is in it. Barry Pepper is in it. Got a wonderful cast. And like I said, it's a true story. It's mostly set in Louisiana, Arkansas, and eastern Oklahoma, but it's being shot locally, Fort Worth, Glen Rose, places like that. And so I've been driving all over Texas, and some days my office is the Brazos River, and some days it's some historical building in, Glen Rose or places like that.
You
And
got it good. Look at you.
oh, dude, let me
Enjoying
tell you
life.
something. It is the coolest thing. I always like being a producer better than being on the air, because Ron used to say, you can find 5,000 people who want to stand in the spotlight, but only a few who are willing to hold it for someone else. And when you're building things or doing something to make someone else look good, it satisfies a completely different part of the ego. It's a thrill. And on top of everything, I get to go from a story about Jesus to a Western. If you're a Texan, you can't beat that.
No.
So, and I get to go out, and I told people that working in radio and TV made me want to beat something with a hammer. Well, that's what I'm doing.
See, I told you when we introduced him to me, he's the quintessential Texan. And there you go. You Cowboys. Jody, thank you so much for joining us. It's really been a pleasure, and I'm so glad we had a little bit of time here to connect in semi-real life.
Fellas, I really appreciate it. Y'all I follow y'all completely, and I really enjoyed the last few podcasts talking about radio. I watched Mondo and Jagger and the rest of the people that you guys have had on, and it just always kindles some really wonderful memories of some great people. I didn't enjoy the last few years in radio as much as I could have. I'm sure the people who work with me didn't enjoy me either, but it refreshes all the warm, wonderful memories of the people that I was close to and miss a great deal. And it's really spectacular what you guys pulled off, and it's nice to see it continue here online.
How do people follow you on Twitter? I'm a big fan of your Twitter feed.
Just look me up, DFW Jody Dean, at DFW Jody Dean. I'm pretty outspoken there. I've kind of dialed it back lately because I just don't have the time.
So tiring.
Yeah, and I'm on Facebook, of course, and then my website, which unfortunately I have not paid attention to terribly recently, is jodydean.com, and there's always stuff on there. I try to keep it updated, but like I said, it's kind of hard when you're out in Palo Pinto building a trading post to find an internet connection.
God, I'm so jealous. I'm a struggling wannabe writer, and I look at Taylor Sheridan. I don't understand how someone can be that prolific. I just don't get it.
He graduated 10 years after I did from the same high school. We had the same drama teacher. And
Really?
I've asked Ms. Williams, what did you teach him that you didn't teach me?
He's the most powerful man in American television.
He's basically keeping Paramount afloat.
He's the
by
reason.
himself.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And he's got a lot more stories to tell, a lot more goods to deliver, and it's really cool being a part of a project like that tells a good story it's going to give a lot more kids a real hero they could look up to.
Jody, did you watch Sons of Anarchy?
I did, yeah.
Do you remember Taylor Sheridan was Officer Hale?
I know.
He was just like a sidekick cop. He was
I know. And it's cool. It's cool.
And now he's the most powerful man in television.
If you've been around Dallas-Fort Worth for a long time, you know that at one time we fancied ourselves as the third coast. And that kind of died because the state didn't really support it very much. Well, I think there's 7 shows, films, and series that are shooting locally around Dallas-Fort Worth right now, and there are many more down in Austin, of course.
Yeah.
But this is happening organically without much support from the state of Texas. And that, I think, means it will last longer. And the stuff that's being turned out is quality. And I'm very grateful to be a part of all that.
It is. Jody, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you, fellas. Thank you very much. I'll be tuning in again next week.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's every day. So
every day.
We caught you there.
It's hard, man. You turn out so much content.
I know.
It's like morning, noon, and night, or noon and night, and I'm like, wow, I can't keep up. So, I watch and I pay attention as catch can, sometimes in my truck. So it's always good to see.
I got very little going on. Thank you, Jody. Ladies and gentlemen, the greatness, Jody Dean. E, you got something in closing?
Oh, no, I'm just saying when I add the rest of the fire story to the Ron Chapman, you'll really
I want to hear it.
Beers. We'll go out for steaks and beers, and you got to hear this story.
I got to at Louis.
Yeah.
You got to go to Louis.
There you go.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's the great Jody Dean, Dallas-Fort Worth broadcast icon. James Parker leaves too. All righty, I guess you're leaving as well. Anything in closing? We're all leaving. There you go. What? Everybody just left me. Like my arm here on my microphone collapsed in the middle of the show. It's probably because I was so intimidated speaking with Mr. Dean that I was nervously rocking my arm back and forth. So now I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes trying to fix that. Love y'all. We'll see you tomorrow. Be good to each other. Be nice to each other, huh? Let's choose to be optimistic and think positive. We don't need to be angry. Although tomorrow's going to be one of them angry days. Oh, boy. We going to get a perp walk? I don't know. We'll cover it all on High Noon tomorrow. Noon, 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. All your headlines, hot topics, current events, and all that good stuff. I'm just going to run through it all tomorrow at noon as I do every Monday through Friday. Love y'all. We'll talk to you soon. And I guess this is going to conclude tonight's Pugs and Parker with E! Show and special guest, the great Jody Dean. Bye, everybody.